Hi, for anybody who didn't join any of the previous sessions, I'm Becky Pearce. I'm a paediatric physio. I run Hampshire Children's Physiotherapy. Jenny has my contact details if there are any questions you have that you want to address to me privately, or you can Google Hampshire Children's Physio and find me there, and hopefully I can be of service to you. So in our last few sessions, well, our first session, we looked at the foundations of movement. So we really focused on head control and the development of flexion and extension to allow head control. And in our second session, we progressed that. So we looked at the development of total body flexion. So that's anything that is curling up into a little ball. And we looked at total body extension, which is anything that is raising up against gravity when a child's lying on their tummy. And with relation to development of flexion and extension, we were looking at rolling and how rolling develops. Now, as I said back then, rolling and any movement that a child learns isn't learnt in isolation. There are other movements being learnt at the same time. So as your child is developing that total body flexion and total body extension, they're developing rolling skills, and they're also developing sitting skills, which is what we're going to focus on today. So the first half of the session is going to be looking at what your child needs to be able to sit and how they learn to sit. And the second part of the session, we'll be looking at more practical advice, handling, equipment, and facilitation that you can use to help your child develop those skills. So first of all, when we're thinking about sitting, there are a few things that you need to be able to sit. So you need enough postural tone and enough strength to sit up against gravity. We have touched on postural tone, we've talked about high tone and low tone and how they affect development of movement, and I can talk about those more specifically, perhaps in the more practical side of the session. But you need to have enough tone to be able to sit up against gravity. You also need to have developed your writing reflexes. So you've got your labyrinthine and your optical reflex. So, which basically means that if your centre of gravity moves, so it's probably better to demonstrate on me than the doll. When your centre of gravity moves, your head will stay in the middle. That's basically what those writing reactions do. So you need to be able to keep your head in alignment when your centre of gravity moves to allow sitting balance. Now, another thing you need and you'll develop along the way is saving reactions in your arm. So a lot of development of sitting involves use of upper limbs for propping and balance, and you need to have those saving reactions. So if you fall to one side, you'll put your arm out to save yourself. So that's something that sometimes can be a bit slow to develop, and you have to work quite hard with children to get those skills of propping and the saving reactions, but they are essential for secure, confident sitting balance. And the other area that you need to develop, which will develop with that flexion and that extension, is some nice rotation and flexibility in your spine to be able to adapt to those changes of posture to maintain your sitting balance. So you need that lovely rotation, flexibility in your spine to achieve sitting. So you need all those things to be able to sit up. Just going to recap very briefly the 5 elements that are essential to movement and that you need to be able to learn movement. I've said them every week. I think they're really important, and when you're looking at your child and seeing what is difficult for them, if they're finding it difficult to learn a movement, it's nice to be able to categorise why and understand why they're having difficulty. So the 5 elements are, the first one is strength. You need strength in your muscles to be able to move your limbs and hold your body against gravity. The essential one with the development of movement for me is stability. You have to have the coordination and the strength to stabilise your body, to move another part of your body against gravity. So you need fixation, stabilisation. So for those children with low tone who haven't got the stability, it's very hard to learn a more distal movement further away from the body if you don't have that stability centrally. The other one we mentioned is flexibility. You need to have the range of movement in all your joints to be able to carry out the movement required. You also need coordination, and you need purpose. Children will only learn a new movement if there's purpose to it. If that's a learning need or pleasure seeking, they need purpose to learn a movement. So those are the 5 key elements, and they're good to remember. So if we start off looking at sitting. So we're talking about early sitting. So when you've got a child that is only just able to hold head up, will obviously need support to sit. You can't just pop your child on the floor and hope that they're going to sit. They will need support. And if it's a younger child, you might sit on the floor. You might be sitting on their lap, on your lap, or supporting them sitting on a surface. But in every position, they will obviously require support at this stage. So you'll find that your child will, we side on is better now. Your child will slump forwards, and you will have to provide that stability to keep them sitting up. So initially, you'll just find that it's a lot of effort, even just to lift your head up against gravity, and you'll find a little bit of bobbing of the head forwards and backwards as they haven't got that strength in their spine. So as they practice sitting, they'll get more strength in those lovely spinal muscles down their back and just be able to hold their head up just for a little bit longer. So you'll lose that bobbing and you'll get a little bit prolonged sitting. At this stage, at the early stages of sitting, you might see your child's arms in this position, in that position. And any child that is struggling with sitting balance might use this position when sitting. When you're supporting, they'll still be bringing their arms back. So what you're seeing there is an elevation of the shoulder girdle and what we call retraction, which is pulling back of the shoulders, bent elbows, and they're doing that for stability. They haven't got the muscle control around their chest and shoulder girdle at that stage to hold up against gravity, and they're using everything possible to hold themselves up in sitting. So you'll see a lot of this stabilisation and a lot of this movement, which is quite normal in the early stages of sitting, but it's something that some children might hold on to for longer, particularly those with increased tone. They might use that as a stabilising position, and the muscles are overacting in that position, but that's something to look out for as well. At this stage, from the waist down really, so the pelvis and the legs aren't really doing a lot to help in sitting. So you're supporting around the chest quite high, and then they're working above that point of support, and the pelvis and the legs are not really doing a lot to help stability at that point. And also we talked about the early stages of development when the child's spine is quite C-shaped and quite curved. So at this stage in sitting, you'll probably be seeing quite a flexed C-shaped spine. They won't have that lovely S shape that an adult has in their spine at this stage. It's to be quite curved. So you're seeing that curved spine, slumped forwards, and lots of support needed. But as you provide your child with that support in that position, they will begin to develop these muscles down their back. You will start to see a reduction in that stabilisation position of their arms as they get more control in their trunk and their back. They're not going to be so reliant on this position for stability. You'll see that the hips at this stage, because when we talked about development on tummies, this was in the previous session on rolling and tummy time development and lying on your back development, we talked about how gravity helps to open the hips out as well. And you also need that for sitting. If your hips are rolled in and quite tight, you can't produce that nice stable position for sitting. But as gravity and tummy lying are all helping to open out hips, I don't know whether you can see that on the baby, you can see that on me, opening the hips out and providing a slightly bigger base of support here to be able to start controlling movement further down the body. At this stage though, your child will still be quite tilted backwards when they're sitting. So if I show with me, quite tilted back. So the pelvis is tilted back, not sitting with a a nice straight spine like this. They're quite tilted back, but that is a good thing to start with. If you're in that tilted back position, it actually allows your head, which is the heavy part of your body, will naturally come forwards. So rather than the upright position where you have to work really hard to keep sitting balance, if your pelvis is tipped back and your head comes forward, that's a more stable position. So you can begin to develop other skills in that stable position. So you will find that their pelvis is quite tilted back, heads forward, and they begin to use their arms just a little bit to help them prop. So that's what you'll see is a bit of development of movement. So as this progression continues, you'll see that hips begin to rotate out, wiggle back a bit. So you've got what we call external rotation of the hip, so it's the hip rolling out. You've got abduction, which is the hip moving away from the body. So that external rotation and that abduction is allowing that ring sitting position, which is a nice stable position. So once you've got that, you'll be developing a little bit more stability around the pelvis. You're developing that pelvis that was tilted back will be able to come forwards and up a little bit, so you get a little bit more of a curve in the bottom part of the back. So you've got that nice lumbar extension, we call it. So once you're getting a little bit more stability around the hips, you'll see that your child can then begin to work on the muscles in their tummy and their chest up against gravity. And once they've got that stable pelvis, trunk developing, they'll start to experiment a little bit more with using hands. So you might find when they're using their arms to begin to prop, because they've got a little bit of rotation going on, arms to prop, usually forwards, so that's a better position. And then you can see sometimes they might actually lift one arm up to reach, using the other arm to prop. So as the pelvis gets stronger, the tummy gets stronger, the muscles start coordinating and working together, you'll see them using their arms a little bit more. Just to say at this stage, it's not just floor sitting. I'm demonstrating all this on floor sitting, but your child will be sitting in other positions. They'll be sitting up in a high chair. Obviously, that's with knees bent, feet on floor. That is still developing that thoracic control, that pelvic control, but in a different position. And it's really important that they have that variety of sitting positions. So at this stage as well, you might even have sort of little sit-on toys that they can sit on, little rocking horses, little ride-on toys that they can sit on. Sometimes you have the bumbo seats, or a little stool. Yeah, all sorts of different sitting options, not just on the floor, and that's really important because every child develops their sitting balance in a slightly different way. There isn't a complete recipe. They use slightly different positions and slightly different muscles to help stabilize themselves. So using different types of seating can really help this development. So once they have that stable support, that nice fixed pelvis, and their trunk is beginning to work, you'll see that they start experimenting with slightly different positions. Oh, you've lost his legs. Move back a little bit. There we go. So again, this might be easier to show on myself. So the ring sitting position, that's with the knees bent and the feet touching. You might see that they perhaps straighten one leg out. And by doing that, flexing one up, straightening one out, you can see you need quite a lot of hip mobility on this side to be able to do that, but you'll see that they can actually get a lot more rotation in that position. So as they get stronger, they can use their flexor muscles and their extensor muscles together to get that rotation, which we talked about in the last session. In sitting, they can begin to use that a little bit more. So if you bend one leg up, that actually gives you more flexibility in the sitting position. Opposite, if you've got your leg out straight, and you try and lean forwards, actually you can't. So that is a position of stability, because your hamstrings are tight in that position and it doesn't let your pelvis move forward. So I can probably demonstrate on me better. So if I'm sitting with my legs out, my hamstrings are really tight, and I try and lean forwards, I'm in a really stable position. I'm not going to flop forwards here because I'm stuck. But if I bend this knee up, then I've got loads of flexibility. So that's a position of flexibility. But you have to have lots of rotation and flexibility, that hip, to allow that movement in sitting. But it's as your child's core has got stronger, stable pelvic stability, you can then you'll see them experimenting with these different positions, different movements. So at this point, you've got good coordination of muscles, and it takes quite a lot of coordination to work out the balance between that flexion and that extension to achieve that sitting balance. And they're beginning to use a lot more rotation, a little bit of arm propping. And this is probably the stage where you might feel happy just to leave your child on the floor, sitting independently, maybe with lots of cushions around. And it's good to do that. They will fall over, but that's all part of learning. As long as they're safe and they're not going to hurt themselves falling onto a cushion, then it's a really nice thing to do to give them that independence to work on that free sitting. Now, once they're in this independent sitting position, you'll see that they start to experiment even more with rotation and actually getting some weight shift from side to side. So it's nice. I won't talk too much about the practical side because we'll do that later, but if you put a toy slightly out of reach over here, you'll find that they'll start reaching out of their base of support. So to start with, they stay very much in their base of support, and then they'll start reaching out. Maybe put one hand down, get a little bit of rotation in, or reach out with this hand, accidentally fall over. But it's all very good practice. So working on rotation and reaching and just using a whole variety of different positions. Now, it isn't until your child has got full independent sitting balance that they're going to learn to move in and out of sitting. Now, a child who is struggling with sitting balance, physios often use the sequence of moving in and out of sitting to help develop their sitting balance. But normal progression would be that the child independently sit before they move in and out of that sitting position. So I will cover later how you can guide your child from sitting to lying and lying to sitting, but this will only start to develop once they have got that independent sitting. Right, let me just see little transitions. Just to note, actually, talking about transitions, a child will first of all learn to get into a sitting position from lying from their tummy. So they will push up from prone, from their tummy up into sitting. That is the movement that comes first. So the movement from side lying into sitting comes a bit later, and the movement from actually lying down up into sitting won't actually come until the child is about 5 or 6 years old. So that's a long way down the line. So initially you'll find that it's the tummy lying, pushing up onto all fours into sitting. That is the first one to develop. So to do that, you need lots of spinal rotation. You need to be able to weight shift from side to side. You need lots of hip flexibility, and you need to be really dynamic in sitting. So none of these will come until your child's got developed all those areas. So you might want to be working on those. I'm sure that's the sort of thing that we can cover in the second half. So if I just run through how a child moves from lying to sitting, I will do the transitions in the second half in a little bit more detail. But what you'll find is when they're on their tummy, so going back to our development in tummy lying. So we talked about how they begin to push up on extended arms. Get that nice curve in the back. And what you'll see is that flexion coming in. I'll bend the hips back and I'll be in that 4-point kneeling position. So from this point, because my baby here is not particularly flexible, I'll demonstrate on myself because I think it's a little bit clearer. Just pop you over there a minute. So we've pushed up into that 4-point kneeling position. And what will happen at this point is that the child will weight shift onto one hip, start to take the weight on one arm. This side of the trunk will elongate, will stretch out, this side will crunch up, we'll bring this knee forwards and come into the sitting position. Now that coordinated movement takes quite a long time to master, and there'll be a lot of falling and a lot of experimentation and repetition. What you might find to start with is that your child just flops down in that position, so it isn't moving a hip forward. And at that point, that's going to be a tricky position, not very efficient, and your child will have to move hands around to come into a sitting position. Whereas as it develops, you can see weight going onto this arm, bringing that hip forwards into sitting is much more efficient. I'm there already. Requires a lot of mobile weight bearing over this arm, which is a complex, tricky movement. We'll cover that in forthcoming sessions when we're talking about more about crawling, mobile weight bearing over your arm. And we did talk about the shoulder joints being very reliant on muscle strength to provide stability. It's not like your pelvis, which is really solid and secure. Your shoulder does rely on lots of muscles to stabilise. So some children, it can be very difficult to develop that shoulder stability. And a lot of work, physio, with regards to sitting is all about propping, learning to prop, saving reactions, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's a very important element of sitting. But that's how your child will get from tummy lying, pushing up into 4-point kneeling, bringing a knee through and coming into the sitting position, which we'll go through in more detail in a minute. So the opposite, your child will begin to move from sitting into lying. So what happens at that point is that your child will bring their weight forwards over the pelvis. So the pelvis will come forwards. Hand will come onto the floor. There'll be a little bit of rotation because they're doing that, beginning to transfer their weight from side to side, a little bit of rotation. And usually at this point, it's a fall and the legs will spring out behind. And that will take a lot of refinement. So a normally developing child will practice that over and over and over again. So it may be that with your children, it's something you need to practice and practice and practice. And as physios, we guide you through that process of facilitating that movement over and over until the pathways are laid down and the children learn that movement. So that is just a whistle-stop tour of transitions. Just remember you need independent sitting balance first, and then you will consider the movement transitions between the two. So I think that covers a very whistle-stop tour of what you need for sitting balance. And then in the second half, if we just go through the more physio practical side of how you can help your child to sit. Anyone have any questions at that point?